NATO's mission in Latvia to beef up its defences against a possible Russian attack. On a visit to Rome, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg met with the foreign minister. The pair announced that 140 troops would be joining the Baltic mission by spring next year.
In recent weeks, Russia has deployed missile systems closer to alliance borders that could carry nuclear weapons. Allies are deeply concerned about this behavior. We will continue pursuing our policy of strong defense combined with political dialogue.
Italy will lead an ultra-rapid action force in the Baltic nation, equipped to intervene within 5 days in an emergency situation. Italy's foreign minister said the decision to send troops was not connected to recent events. Russia responded to the news with the foreign ministry spokesperson saying that NATO is building new dividing lines in Europe, while the leader of Italy's five-star movement said Russia is a partner, not an enemy.
The Russians, the U.S. Air Force, latest test sending a massive message to Vladimir Putin. Now, they write here that last month the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command and the National Nuclear Security Administration, listen to this, conducted joint flight tests with 2 fake nuclear bombs on board. Okay? Think about that. 2 fake nuclear bombs. They write that the fake B-61 bombs, both of which contained sensors and instrumentation that allowed scientists and engineers from national laboratories to assess their performance, were successfully dropped over a test range in Nevada, according to NNSA News Briefing. They say that the object of the test was to obtain reliability, accuracy, and performance data under operationally representative conditions. That's according to the press release. They say, lo and behold, the fake bombs performed brilliantly. So well, in fact, they garnered the attention of Russia, which has of late upped its aggressive behavior on the world stage. They state that in particular, the successful tests gained the attention of the Sputnik News Agency, an online news and radio broadcast service established by the nation's government-controlled news agency, Rosoya. They state that the, quote, Air Force conducted successful tests with 2 B-61 nuclear bombs. The agency reported, although it was quick to mention that neither carried a live warhead. They state that this acknowledgement from the Russians was good news for the simple fact that the rogue nation's political leaders needed to get it through their thick skulls. They state that America was more equipped to handle them if they keep up their aggressive antics. That's according to the Daily Wire. They also state Russia was openly threatening the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, bombing civilians in Syria, and allegedly interfering with U.S. elections by orchestrating the release hack of documents. So this is sending a strong message, my friends. Look, we've been covering the road to World War III for a very long time here, and what is happening on the world stage? First of all, you've got the South China Sea conflict, which is boiling. You've got the Korean Peninsula, which there's always massive war games taking place there, and Kim Jong-un is constantly launching ballistic missiles, levying threats at the United States. And you have the Baltics, where you have NATO increasing its aggressive advances into the Baltic states with rotational battalions on a non-permanent basis, right? Of course, they're just rotational. Then you have the missile base that's now being built in Poland, and of course the one that's gone active in Romania. All of these activities, and not to mention what the tension in the proxy war between Syria and the United States, between Russia and the United States and Syria, is just bringing things to a head. Now, we've been watching how the Russian military is rapidly advancing their technology. They were able to pull off live warfare environments with their technology to put it through the test in a live environment. And now the United States, they're retrofitting a lot of their nuclear weapons. So this is an example of the United States sending that message by dropping bombs that they don't actually have the nuclear material on them, but they're ready to go. All right? Which means that they're just flexing their muscle in the face of the new Russian aggression that we keep hearing from Hillary Clinton.
Major military build-up outside Mosul ahead of a planned offensive to retake the ISIL-held city. The operation to retake Mosul is expected to be the most complex yet for Iraq's army and comes as the US-led coalition increases airstrikes against militants in and around the city. We arrived here at 4 a.m. during sunrise, this soldier said. We've come to liberate Mosul. We'll liberate it, and we'll make sure the families can return home. Mosul's been under ISIL control for more than 2 years. Around 30,000 Iraqi and coalition forces are expected to take part in the offensive, which the United Nations fears could spark a major humanitarian emergency.
The UN estimates that in a worst-case scenario, Mosul could represent the single largest, most complex humanitarian operation in the world in 2016. There are a number of reasons why it's so complex. The sheer scope of the expected operation. In a worst-case scenario, there could be 1.2 to 1.5 million civilians inside of the city who could be impacted.
Potentially the biggest battle in Iraq since the US-led invasion in 2003, the assault for Mosul is predicted to begin by the end of this month.
3 radar stations in rebel-controlled territories with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, all 3 sites, we believe, have been destroyed. The strikes came in retaliation for failed missile attacks on a U.S. Navy destroyer off the coast. The latest was carried out on Wednesday. The Pentagon maintains the sites were in remote areas where the risk of civilian casualties was low. Washington also insists on the defensive nature of the attack, which was approved by President Obama.
These limited self-defense strikes were conducted to protect our personnel, our ships, our freedom of navigation in this important maritime passageway. The United States will respond to any further threat to our ships and commercial traffic.
Well, the attack on the U.S. warship by Houthi rebels came after a suspected Saudi-led airstrike on a funeral in the rebel-held capital, Sana'a. Previously, Washington only provided weapons and intelligence to Riyadh, which supports the internationally recognized Yemeni government. On Sunday, thousands protested in Sana'a over the funeral bombing, the latest in a series of Saudi-led strikes.
Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council are an integral part of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. They transport weapons to them on a regular basis. They just approved a few weeks ago a massive arms sale and transfer to Riyadh. This is not going to stop. They utilize Saudi Arabia in regard to their attacks on Syria, as well as Iraq and Yemen. So Saudi Arabia is functioning as a foreign policy military wing of the United States Pentagon and the White House, as well as the State Department.
Syria hinting it may respond with its own missiles. Washington has reportedly been considering limited airstrikes on Assad's forces. The Defense Ministry in Moscow said such an attack would threaten its troops, who would respond immediately, as they wouldn't have time to work out where incoming rockets or aircraft were coming from. I would recommend that our Washington colleagues carefully consider the possible consequences of implementing such plans. I'd like to remind US strategists that air cover for Russian air bases is provided by S-400 and S-300 air defense systems, whose radius of action could become a surprise for any unidentified flying objects. Washington says its deliberations about possible non-diplomatic options will continue as the Syrian army tightens its grip on Aleppo. Rebels have said they have no plan to evacuate the city, denouncing an amnesty offer by Damascus as a trap. The UN is warning of catastrophe.
In maximum 2 months, 2.5 months, the city of eastern Aleppo at this rate may be totally destroyed. We're talking about old city in particular. And thousands of Syrian civilians, not terrorists, will be killed.
Damascus has said rebels can leave with their families if they lay down their arms, but anyone who remains will face an inevitable fate. Washington has dismissed the idea that Assad would protect people as outrageous, given the high civilian death toll from his forces' airstrike.
Caught a Russian aircraft carrier and 7 accompanying vessels as they pass by UK waters. RT's correspondent Polly Boyka has more.
Well, the Admiral Kuznetsov is Russia's only aircraft carrier. It carries helicopters and aircraft if it needs to. And the press service for Russia's Northern Fleet has confirmed that the aircraft carrier and a number of accompanying ships have left Severomorsk, which is a Russian port town in the north, up near Finland, and it's headed for the Mediterranean. So at the moment, this group of ships and the aircraft carrier are somewhere in the Barents Sea. Now, the Northern Fleet has also confirmed that the group of ships will be carrying out some military drills on the way, and that route from the north down to the Med will take the Russian ships through the North Sea, past Scotland, down the British coast and through the English Channel, which is why the Royal Navy is going to be keeping a very close eye on the group of ships sailing past the UK and accompanying them as they do that. Now, officially, the Royal Navy has released a statement saying that it's completely standard procedure for NATO and the Royal Navy to monitor any foreign ships that pass their so-called area of interest, i.e. close to their waters. So these are the bare bones of the story, but the local media here has presented the whole thing in a somewhat more dramatic fashion. You've got headlines, things like the Russians posturing, Putin flexing his military muscles, and stuff like the Russians are coming, the Royal Navy is on standby. Newspaper articles that make the whole affair sound very confrontational and quite unexpected, when in reality we first got reports that this Russian aircraft carrier was going to be moved up from the north down to the Med from as far back as July. It was confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense in September. So this is something that's been on the cards for a while, but it's kind of being misreported, and at the same time the story is snowballing and getting bigger, especially in the light of the current diplomatic tensions between the UK and Russia over Syria.
One political commentator told us that the UK's media overreacted, spurred on by strong anti-Russian feelings that exist in Britain right now.
There isn't anything to suggest that there is a direct threat or anything, but at the end of the day, we need to understand the environment in Britain, which is about confronting Russia at the moment. And this is not the official statement by the government, but actually by some hot-headed MPs. So whether the route of the Admiral Kuznetsov really was as close as passing through the English Channel previously or originally, or it was adjusted afterwards, we don't know. But it could be a hyper reaction towards the towards any Russian vessel or any Russian military action nearby because of this particular environment that we live in Britain at the moment.
Added hundreds of new warheads to its nuclear arsenal. According to Bill Gertz at the Washington Free Beacon, he reports that Russia increased its deployed nuclear warheads over the past 6 months under a strategic arms reduction treaty. They've added warheads under a reduction treaty. This is the U.S. nuclear warhead stocks. Meanwhile, U.S. nuclear warhead stocks declined sharply, according to the State Department. They say that during the very same period, the United States cut its deployed nuclear warheads by 114, increasing the disparity between the two nuclear powers. They write Russia's warhead increases since 2011 suggest that Moscow does not intend to cut its nuclear forces and will abandon the New START arms accord as part of a new major nuclear buildup. You see, President Putin sees President Obama as just a weak president, and he doesn't care. He knows he's not going to do anything because Obama's too concerned about sex changes in the military, about forcing his national security services to do diversity and inclusion training. I mean, meanwhile, Putin's like, fine, we're going to build up our military. We're going to go to war in Syria. We're going to make Obama look like a bitch in front of the world, and that's what he's doing. They say, quote, "It is now highly unlikely that Russia intends to comply with the New START treaty," said Mark Schneider, a former Pentagon nuclear weapons specialist, now with the National Institute for Policy. They say at the same time the Obama administration is continuing a program of unilateral nuclear disarmament despite promises by Obama to modernize and maintain nuclear forces as long as strategic dangers are present. They state the latest Russian warhead increases coincide with increased tensions between Moscow and the West. Okay, thanks, Obama. We're all going to get nuked now because you're too concerned about which bathroom the CIA is using when they have to go to the bathroom. Unbelievable.
And few people foresaw the consequences. America's mission was to dismantle the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but a decade and a half later, the security situation is still dire. RT's Gayane Chichakian looks at America's military legacy in the country.
How many times Americans heard the war in Afghanistan is almost over, almost won, and yet it drags on, more silently than before, but it continues, and Washington keeps changing plans.
The United States will maintain approximately 8,400 troops in Afghanistan into next year through the end of my administration. Together with our allies and the Afghan government, we have agreed that this is the year we will conclude our combat mission in Afghanistan. It is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war.
Having crippled Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan a long time ago, the U.S. spent years and enormous resources fighting the Taliban. Despite these efforts, the Taliban today is resurgent. It is set to control roughly a third of Afghanistan. And guess what? Terrorists are finding a safe haven there again. ISIL has gained a foothold in Afghanistan. It runs a training camp there, even a school for children. All of which makes one ask, after all the lives sacrificed and resources spent, could Afghanistan be back to square one? One thing that did change dramatically in Afghanistan since the beginning of the war is opium production. It skyrocketed. 90% of heroin in the world now comes from Afghanistan. Roughly a year before the war, the Taliban banned opium cultivation, decided it was un-Islamic. And you see how over the years, it went up 40 times from 2001. The Taliban now actually use drug production as a source of income. The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, recently described the fight against the Taliban as a stalemate. The insurgents made gains as the U.S. withdrew the bulk of its troops. Washington now calls for a reconciliation with the Taliban. The Taliban do not seem to reciprocate. In April, they admitted to an attempt on Secretary of State John Kerry's life when he was in Afghanistan.
What we're seeing is 15 years later, the situation is as intractable as it ever was. They have lived through decades of war now. They are the second poorest country in the world. They are a country where the position of women is one of the most dangerous in the world. There are millions of Afghans who are refugees. And many of them try to get to Europe, most of them don't get to Europe. What we've heard this time and time again, that they're constantly saying, we go to war, they spend an absolute fortune on these wars, and they say that this will bring peace and democracy and stability to the country. Then when it doesn't, then when you have a corrupt government, when you have a government whose writ doesn't run in large parts of the country, they say, well, they have to implement reforms. Now, they've tried all this before. It doesn't work, and it doesn't work because you can't impose this kind of imperial settlement on any country.
Afghanistan has turned into America's quagmire, and the question of troop withdrawal has become, as the saying goes, damned if you do, damned if you don't. In Washington, I'm Gayane Chichakian, RT.
All right, to talk more about this, I'm being joined now by Barry Ladendorf, president of Veterans for Peace. Barry, thank you so much for being with us today. We are 15 years into this war in Afghanistan, longer than our involvement in Vietnam, and now we're looking at a coming third president to deal with this conflict, yet we hear so little about it from any of the candidates. Why do you think this topic has been scant in the 2016 elections?
Well, I think one of the problems is that nobody knows what to do. What we do know is that what we've done in the past just doesn't seem to work. You know, invading more countries, dropping more bombs, killing innocent civilians in Muslim countries, and trying to occupy these countries and create governments that they do not want has been a formula not for success but for failure. And the American troops are paying the price for that, coming home as they are, suffering from tremendous cases of post-traumatic stress. The suicide rate among our returning soldiers is high. They've had multiple deployments. And one of the things recently, a recent poll conducted by the Military Times suggests that the U.S. soldiers are tired of these wars, that 55% of them think that being involved in nation building in these countries in the Middle East is not successful, it's not working, and we need a new change policy.
Now, I'm glad you brought up the occupation and the 22 suicides per day on average, because this group of veterans has the highest suicide average than any other returning group of within the U.S. military history. Now, we're seeing the resurgence of the Taliban. It's roaring through Afghanistan. Huge refugee outflows. America still has almost 9,000 troops on the ground there today, they say, for support. Is America gonna continue to be an indefinite occupier of Afghanistan?
Well, it certainly seems like that's the case. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing little discussion about that is that I don't believe the American people have the stomach for it or the will to be involved in these protracted wars. And so it's not part of the public debate, and it ought to be. And just to give you an example, you know, the United States Congress has not debated these issues. The authorization for the use of military force that was passed in 2001 is still used as a crutch by the administrations and probably in the future to continue these ongoing wars. There is pending in the Congress a new authorization for the use of military force, and they have not even brought that up for debate or discussion. Now, one of the reasons they haven't done that is that President Obama says no matter how they vote on it, he still thinks he has the authority to engage in these endless wars and conflicts in the Middle East, and including in Afghanistan. So the question is then, why would a congressman stick their neck out and vote one way or the other? Because no matter how they vote, it's not going to be well received, whether it's a yes vote or a no vote. So the problem is we don't have a Congress or in which we have engaged in a public debate and a public discussion on it. And part of that reason is, I think, is that the military-industrial complex in this country is, you know, wars are profitable. And as long as those in power find it profitable to go to war, there's little incentive to get out of it. And so I don't see something happening unless the people rise up and demand that the U.S. withdraw from these wars.
It is profitable, certainly, but the U.S. has seen about 2,400 military deaths, more than 20,000 wounded. None of these numbers even include private security contractors. America has spent over $110 billion on rebuilding Afghanistan. This isn't including the hard cost to fund the war itself. At what point should the new president say it's time to cut our losses and get out?
Well, I think the new president, whoever it is, should do that when they take office. Frankly, I think the current president ought to say that. What we ought to do is go to the UN and the Security Council, bring all these players into a discussion about how can we advance the peace process. What I'd like to see the United States do, instead of funding Afghanistan or the rest of the Middle East with arms, which end up being used by various sides, even those who we oppose, and to say to the world and to the people of the Middle East, the United States is not going to engage in these in weapons supply, be the major weapons supplier in the Middle East. We're going to take that money, we're going to use it for refugees. We're going to help the people that we have run out of their homes. 2 million in Afghanistan or in Iraq, for example, 2 million displaced in Iraq, 2 million outside of the country. The same in Afghanistan. The country is coming apart. It's because we're there. As long as the United States is on the ground there, there's not going to be a solution. And I think that goes for the rest of the Middle East. As long as foreign countries, no matter from whether it's Russia or the United States,